The king required a bride to silence his council, and so he chose the one who had mastered the choice of when to be seen. It was an act of profound and elegant strategy, performed not with a sword, but with a single, deliberate gesture in the humid squalor of a dockside tavern. The air inside the salty siren was thick with the ghosts of spilled ale and unwashed bodies, a choking, living thing that clung to the back of the throat. It was here, amidst the grime and desperation, that he found her. She moved between the rough-hewn tables like a wisp of smoke, a girl whose edges had been worn smooth by hardship. Her apron was stained, her hands chapped, but her movements were a kind of silent music, a ballet of quiet efficiency. He watched her for precisely 7 minutes, but he had been watching her, through his spies, for 3 months. He had watched reports of her hands flying in animated conversation with her friend, creating entire worlds in the air. He had watched her negotiate with merchants, her signs sharp and businesslike. He had watched her comfort a crying child with gentle, flowing gestures. She was an expert at being invisible by choice. She could vanish in a crowd when she wanted, or command a room with her hands when she needed. That control, that deliberate agency, that was what he needed. Someone who could be silent when politics demanded it, but speak volumes when he chose to listen. And for 3 months, he had been learning her language. Lord Valerius, the king's most senior and most despised advisor, stood stiffly at his master's shoulder, a statue of disapproval carved from obsidian and silver. His lip was curled in a permanent sneer, as if the very air of the mortal world was a personal offense. "My liege," he murmured, his voice a dry rustle of ancient parchment. "Surely a jest. The council speaks of alliances, of powerful bloodlines. This is an insect." King Cassian did not turn. His eyes, the color of a winter night, remained fixed on the girl. "The council is split between 3 factions, Valerius. The northern bloc backs Lady Seraphina. The southern families champion Lady Isadora. The Eastern Alliance pushes for a union with the Mordain dynasty. Each alliance would destabilize everything we have built. Each bride brings a web of obligations and ambitions that would strangle this kingdom within a generation." His voice was low, a velvet rumble that seemed to absorb the tavern's clamor. "She brings nothing, no faction, no family, no political debt. She is the only choice that makes no enemies because she makes no alliances." Valerius was silent for a moment, his ancient mind processing the elegant brutality of the strategy. And they cannot refuse without admitting they value their own ambitions over the crown's autonomy. A thin smile touched his bloodless lips. "Brilliant, my king, and temporary, I presume?" "Once the factions exhaust themselves, watch," Cassian interrupted, his gaze never leaving the girl. Emma was, laughing, her whole body shaking with silent mirth at something her friend Anya had signed. Her hands flew in response, painting pictures in the air, her face alight with joy and mischief. Then a drunk sailor lurched toward her, and the transformation was instant. The light vanished. Her shoulders curved inward, her gaze dropped, and she became a shadow, slipping away from his grasping hands with a fluid efficiency that spilled not a drop from her tray. She was a ghost, beneath notice. Then she reached Anya again, and the light returned, her hands resuming their conversation. "She is not invisible by circumstance, Valerius. She is invisible by mastery. She chooses when to be seen." The council wanted eloquence. I will give them someone more eloquent than all of them combined, and watch them too proud to hear a single word. He raised a single, languid finger and pointed. The gesture cut through the smoky air, a pronouncement of fate. Emma did not see it. She was collecting fallen coins that had rolled under a table, her brow furrowed in concentration. It was Anya who saw the king's gesture and gasped, her hands flying in frantic mourning. Emma felt the impact of her friend's terror, straightening slowly. She followed Anya's gaze to the 2 figures by the door. They were apparitions from another world, draped in darkness and smelling of cold stone and winter. One was all sharp angles and silver-haired disdain. The other was the void from which night was born. He was impossibly tall, dressed in black wool that seemed to drink the meager candlelight, his face a masterpiece of cruel beauty. But it was his eyes that held her. They were looking only at her. In that gaze, Emma felt a terrifying sense of being truly seen, and simultaneously of being utterly erased. She was a thing to be looked at, a curiosity, a choice. Cassian watched the dawning comprehension on her face, the flicker of terror that widened her pale eyes. She did not scream. She did not cry out. Her hands, which had been clutching the rescued coins, simply opened, and the copper discs fell to the floor with a series of soft, dull clinks, marking the last seconds of her old life. Her hands moved then, signing to Anya with desperate speed. What do they want? Valerius shifted, his discomfort palpable. She is a defective, my king, a mute. She is not a mute, Cassian corrected, his tone deceptively mild. She simply does not speak with her tongue. She speaks with something far more intentional. He took a step forward, and the world seemed to contract around Emma. He stopped a few feet from her, close enough that she could feel the impossible cold radiating from his body. He raised his hand slowly, deliberately. His fingers moved in the air between them, clumsy but unmistakable. The sign for choice. Then the sign for safety. His winter night eyes never left her face. Emma's breath caught. He was speaking her language. Badly, like a child forming first words, but he was speaking it. Valerius stepped forward and placed a small, heavy purse on the bar, but also a rolled parchment. The tavern keeper, a portly man with fierce sweat glistening on his brow, snatched both, his hands shaking. Paid in full, he muttered. Debts cleared. She's yours, your majesty. An official in dark robes materialized from behind the king, approaching Emma with the parchment. She stared at the incomprehensible words, the heavy wax seals, the official marks. The man looked to the king, uncertain. Cassian's hands moved again. Marriage. His finger pointed to himself, then to her. You will never be hungry again. He fingered the coins in his purse, then made the sign for her friend. Anya. Provided for. Protected. His movements were slow, methodical, ensuring she understood each word. Then his face grew colder, harder. His hand swept back toward the tavern keeper. He owes debts. His fingers formed claws, grasping. Other men. Will come. Will take you. His eyes bored into hers. Choose. Emma's gaze darted to the tavern keeper, who wouldn't meet her eyes. She looked at Anya, whose face was streaked with tears. She looked at her own chapped, work-worn hands. She had always known this day would come in some form. Women like her, with no family and no voice, were bought and sold. At least this buyer spoke her language, however clumsily. At least he offered safety for Anya. Her hands trembled as she raised them. She signed slowly, clearly, so there could be no misunderstanding. I agree. The official thrust a quill into her hand. She made a mark where he pointed, a shaky X. It was done. She was bought. She was paid for. She was married. The journey to the onyx spire, the king's citadel that pierced the permanent cloud cover of the valley, was a blur of cold terror. Emma was wrapped in a cloak of black fur that smelled of him, of night and frost and something ancient, like dust from a sealed tomb. She sat opposite him in a carriage that moved without horses, gliding through the cobbled streets in an unnatural silence. Beside her sat a young woman with pale skin and knowing eyes, Lyra, the king had signed, his maid. Lyra watched Emma with something that might have been sympathy or curiosity. Kazian said nothing. He simply watched Emma, his gaze a physical weight. He was a stone he had picked up from the mud to throw into the placid, stagnant pond of his court. He was already anticipating the ripples, the shocked and furious faces of the ancient families when they realized the finality of his decision. He had married a mortal, a commoner, a girl from a tavern who spoke with her hands. Let them choke on it. The carriage began its ascent, and for the first time, Emma risked a glance out the window, watching the warm, flickering lights of the city below shrink until they were indistinguishable from the stars. She was rising into a world of cold, distant darkness, and she knew, with a certainty that settled like ice in her bones, that she would never feel warm again. The palace was not a home. It was a monument to stillness. Its halls were vast, echoing chasms of polished obsidian and black marble, veined with silver that glittered like trapped starlight. The air was cold and thin, carrying the scent of stone, old paper, and something metallic that reminded Emma of the moments before a thunderstorm. There were no fires in the hearths, no chatter in the corridors, only the whisper of soft-soled shoes on stone and the rustle of fabrics as courtiers passed like elegant ghosts. They were all beautiful, all terrifyingly alike, with pale skin, dark eyes, and an air of predatory grace. Their gazes slid over Emma, then away, their dismissal as sharp and cold as a shard of glass. She was less than nothing to them. She was a vulgarity, a human stain on their perfect, sterile world. She was given rooms in the East Wing, a suite of chambers so large that her entire life, the tavern, the tiny room she shared with Anya, the cramped streets of her neighborhood, could have fit within them. The bed was a mountain of silk and velvet, the wardrobes were filled with gowns of impossible richness, and the windows overlooked a garden of crystalline flowers that chimed softly in the wind. It was a cage of breathtaking beauty. Lyra was assigned to her, and to Emma's shock, the young vampire's hands began to move. Slowly, carefully, signing as she spoke aloud. "I will help you, my lady. The king has asked me to learn your language. I have been studying while he studied. I am not as good as he is, but I will try." Emma's eyes filled with tears. Someone else here could speak to her. She was not utterly alone. Lyra showed her the rooms, explaining the function of every strange and luxurious object, her hands moving in careful tandem with her words. But when Emma tried to ask real questions, "Why am I here? What does he want from me? When can I see Anya?" Lyra's face became carefully blank. She signed simple responses. "The king will explain. You are safe. Your friend is provided for." Emma realized quickly that Lyra could translate facts, but not feelings. The maid was kind, but she was also the king's servant first. And so Emma learned to give only the barest, most formal responses to Lyra's questions. She signed about the temperature of her bath, the taste of her food, the softness of her bed. She did not sign about the screaming loneliness, the suffocating fear, the desperate longing for home. Those words she kept locked inside, and Lyra, for all her careful kindness, never saw them. The wedding, as it was called, took place 3 days after her arrival. It was not a celebration, but a proclamation. Emma was dressed in a gown of silver thread that felt as heavy as chainmail. She was led to the throne room, a cavernous space where the king sat upon a throne carved from a single piece of obsidian. Cassian did not rise. He simply watched her approach, his expression unreadable. The court was assembled, a gallery of disapproving statues. Valerius stood at the foot of the dais, his face a mask of grim satisfaction. This humiliation of the court was everything he had hoped for. A priest, or what passed for one in this dark world, spoke ancient words in a language that felt like stones grinding together. Emma understood none of it. Her part was simple. She was to stand there. She was to be silent. At the end of the pronouncements, Kazian beckoned her forward. She ascended the steps, her legs trembling, the silver gown whispering against the stone. He held out his hand. His skin was impossibly cold, like marble. He slid a ring onto her finger, a band of black metal set with a diamond that seemed to drink the light. It was heavy, a manacle. He was her king, her husband, her jailer. And he had spoken to her only in the briefest, most transactional signs. In the weeks that followed, Emma learned the rhythms of her new life. She was a ghost haunting the edges of a royal portrait. She ate alone at a long, polished table, the food exquisite but tasteless in her mouth. Lyra would sit with her sometimes, signing pleasantries, but the maid was always called away to other duties. Emma walked the silent gardens, the crystal flowers chiming a mournful tune that echoed the hollowness inside her. She learned the faces of the court, the subtle hierarchies, the currents of power that flowed beneath their placid surfaces. She saw the way Lady Seraphina, with her crimson lips and venomous eyes, watched the king with a possessive hunger. She saw the way Lord Gideon, captain of the royal guard, moved with a barely contained violence. And she saw the way they all looked at her, with pity, with contempt, with a cold, calculating curiosity. She was the king's political maneuver, a temporary solution. They were waiting for him to tire of his game, to discard her as easily as he had acquired her. Kazian remained a distant, formidable presence. She would see him at the evening meal, presiding over the head of the table, a figure of absolute authority. He never looked at her. He never spoke to her. He would incline his head to Valerius or exchange a few terse words with Gideon, his voice a low rumble that did nothing to warm the cavernous chill of the dining hall. He was a king playing a part, and she was merely a prop on his stage. He had used her to make his point, and now, it seemed, he had no further use for her. The loneliness was a physical thing, a weight that pressed down on her chest, making it hard to breathe. In her old life, she had been poor, she had been weary, but she had never been truly alone. She had Anya, with whom she could share every thought with a flash of her hands. She had the boisterous, chaotic community of the tavern, the shared jokes, the common struggles. Here, there was only silence, a silence so profound it threatened to swallow her whole. One night, unable to bear the oppressive luxury of her rooms, she wandered into the royal library. It was a place no one seemed to visit, a sanctuary of dust and forgotten knowledge. The shelves soared into the darkness, holding countless books bound in leather and secrets. She ran a hand over their spines, the feel of the tooled leather a small, tangible comfort. She could not read the language, but she could appreciate the craft, the history held within their silent pages. She found a book lying open on a large lectern in the center of the room. It was an atlas, its pages filled with intricate, hand-drawn maps of lands she could not even imagine. She traced the lines of a coastline with her finger, following the curve of a bay, the jagged peaks of a mountain range. For a moment, she was not a prisoner. She was an explorer, lost in a world of wonder. A soft sound from the shadows made her freeze. She turned, her heart leaping into her throat. Kazian was there, standing in the archway of a darkened alcove, watching her. She had no idea how long he had been there. He made no move, no sound, just observed her with those unnervingly still, winter night eyes. Fear, sharp and cold, pierced through her. She had trespassed. She had broken some unspoken rule. She quickly stepped away from the lectern, lowering her eyes, her hands clasped behind her back to stop them from trembling. She waited for the dismissal, the cold command to return to her rooms. But it did not come. Instead, he moved out of the shadows, his steps unnervingly silent on the marble floor. He walked not to her, but to the lectern. He looked down at the map she had been touching, his long, pale fingers hovering over the page. Then he looked at her. And for the first time since the tavern, he seemed to truly see her. Not the pawn, not the symbol, but the person. He pointed to the jagged mountains she had been tracing. Then he raised his own hand, not in command, but in communication. He curled his fingers, mimicking the shape of the peaks. His movements were more fluid now, more practiced than they had been in the tavern. Then he pointed to his own chest and signed with deliberate care. Mine, my home, my mountains. It was a gesture of staggering simplicity, and it struck Emma with the force of a physical blow. After weeks of silence, after being ignored and dismissed, he was speaking to her, in her language. He had not forgotten. He had been practicing. Emma's hands came up slowly, trembling. She pointed to the city at the base of the mountains on the map. Then she signed, her movements hesitant. My home. She looked at him, a question in her eyes. He nodded once. Then he pointed to the palace on the map, high in the peaks. He signed again. Now, your home, our home. It was not a question. It was not quite a command. It was something else. An offering, perhaps. An acknowledgement. Emma felt something crack in her chest, a tiny fissure in the wall of fear and loneliness she had built. She nodded, unable to sign anything else, her vision blurring with tears. He watched her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then he did something that shocked her to her core. He reached out and, with infinite gentleness, caught a tear that had escaped down her cheek. He looked at the moisture on his finger as if it were something precious and strange. Then he signed a word she had taught no one, a word she had only ever used with Anya, a private word. Sad. His movements were perfect, precise. He had been watching her far more carefully than she had ever realized. He lowered his hand and signed again, his movements slow and deliberate. Sorry. It was the first apology she had received from anyone in this cold, beautiful prison. The first acknowledgement that she was a person who could be hurt. She stared at him, this ancient, terrifying king, and saw something in his winter night eyes that she had never expected to see. Uncertainty, regret, and something else. Something that looked almost like loneliness. The moment in the library hung between them, a fragile, shimmering thread in the vast tapestry of silence. Kazian had retreated back into his duties, and Emma had returned to her gilded cage, but something had shifted. A door that had been sealed for centuries had been cracked open, letting in a sliver of unexpected light. He had seen her. He had, for one brief, inexplicable instant, attempted to bridge the chasm that separated their worlds. The memory of his gesture, his hands shaping the mountains, his finger catching her tear, the word sorry, replayed in her mind, a constant, bewildering refrain. It was more communication than she had received from anyone in this palace of whispers and secrets. Kazian found himself wrestling with an unfamiliar sensation. Guilt. The girl, his wife, a voice in his head corrected with dry irony, was not merely a political instrument. He had chosen her for her silence, for her lack of connections. He had expected her to be a docile, frightened creature, a living statue to adorn his palace and frustrate his court. And she was frightened, that much was clear. But she was not merely an absence. In her silent world, she found things to do. He had seen her, through the ever-watchful eyes of his palace guards, spending hours in the abandoned East Wing conservatory. The conservatory had been his mother's, built centuries ago when she had been a mortal bride much like Emma. His father had commissioned it, filling it with glass that could capture and concentrate the weak, filtered light that pierced the perpetual clouds. She had grown roses there, delicate mortal things that needed warmth and sun and care. When she had died, of age, of time, of the simple wearing down of a human body in an inhuman world, his father had sealed the place. Kazian had not entered it in over 500 years. But Emma had found it. She had found the door hidden behind a tapestry, the rusted key in a forgotten drawer. She had found the packets of ancient seeds in a gardener's abandoned shed, brittle and half fossilized. And with patient, gentle hands, she was coaxing tiny, fragile green shoots from pots of earth. Mortal plants, things of disgusting impermanence, destined to wither and die. It was a pointless, futile endeavor, and it fascinated him. He began to observe her more deliberately. He would linger in the shadows of a colonnade as she walked the gardens, her head tilted as if listening to a song only she could hear. He would stand on a high balcony, watching her small figure move through the grand, empty rooms below. She did not weep. She did not rage. She simply existed, with a quiet, stubborn dignity that was, in its own way, a form of defiance. She was not breaking, and the part of him that was a king, a master of breaking things, found this inexplicably irritating. The part of him that had been alone for 1,000 years found it something else. One evening, he dismissed the court from dinner earlier than usual, leaving the two of them alone in the cavernous dining hall. The table between them was a vast, polished expanse, a dark river separating two continents. Emma froze, her fork hovering over her plate, her eyes wide with alarm. This was a deviation from the routine. This was new, and new things in this place were always dangerous. Cassian watched her, the candlelight casting flickering shadows across her face, making her seem even more fragile, more ethereal. He had no plan. He had no words. He simply felt a strange compulsion to break the suffocating silence, not with his voice, but with something more. He pushed his chair back, the sound scraping loudly in the stillness. He walked around the table, his steps measured, deliberate. Emma flinched as he approached, her hands clutching her napkin in her lap. He stopped beside her chair, looming over her. She smelled of soap and fresh linen, a clean, mortal scent that was jarringly out of place in his world of dust and cold stone. He did not touch her. Instead, he picked up her water goblet. It was a heavy, crystal thing, intricately carved. He held it up to the light. Then he looked at her and made a sign. His hand formed a cup, and he brought it to his lips. Drink. It was a simple, universal gesture, but he performed it with the intense, focused concentration he usually reserved for matters of state. Emma stared, her breath caught in her throat. He was doing it again. He was speaking her language. Not through Lyra, not through an intermediary, himself. Slowly, tentatively, she raised her hands from her lap. She mimicked his sign, then she pointed to the goblet and tapped her own chest. My drink. A small, hesitant smile touched her lips, a flicker of light in the shadows of her face. It was the first time he had seen her smile. It was a revelation. It transformed her from a frightened waif into someone. It was a small, human thing, and it struck him with the force of a battering ram, shaking foundations he hadn't known were vulnerable. He felt a sudden, sharp need to see it again. He picked up a silver fork. He held it up. He looked at her, an unspoken question in his eyes. Her smile grew, becoming more confident. Her hands moved, showing him the sign. He copied it, his large hands mimicking her graceful movements. She nodded, her eyes bright. He reached for the salt cellar, the candlestick, the silk napkin. Each time she showed him the word, and each time he learned it, his ancient mind cataloging and storing with the precision of a scholar. For the first time in weeks, Emma felt something other than fear. She felt useful. She felt seen. And when Cassien finally stepped back, inclining his head in a small, formal bow of thanks, she realized with a start that she was no longer afraid of him. She was curious. And so began their strange, silent lessons. They met in the library after the evening meals, their secret classroom. At first, it was objects. He would point to a book, a chair, a window, and she would give him the sign. Her hands, which had seemed so small and fragile, became masterful instruments, weaving complex ideas and images from the air. He was a surprisingly adept student. His ancient mind, accustomed to deciphering political codes and battle strategies, absorbed the new language with an unnerving speed. He learned the sign for moon and star and sky. He learned the sign for sad, and she showed him by touching her chin and drawing her hand down, a falling tear. He learned the sign for alone, and she showed him by holding up a single index finger and drawing a circle around it, a solitary figure in an empty world. He learned the sign for beautiful, and without thinking, he looked at her as he formed it. She blushed, the color rising in her cheeks, and looked away. He, in turn, began to show her his world. He took her to the high observatory at the top of the citadel, the one tower that broke through the permanent cloud cover into clear, cold air. There, a massive brass telescope pointed toward the heavens. He helped her onto the stool and guided her eye to the lens. She gasped, her hands flying to her mouth. She saw the scarred, pockmarked face of the moon, so close she felt she could touch it. She saw the distant, glittering nebulae, clouds of infant stars being born in the cosmic darkness. He stood behind her, watching not the stars, but the reflection of their light in her wide, wondrous eyes. He showed her the royal treasury, not the piles of gold and jewels, but the artifacts of his long history. A fossilized leaf from a tree that had gone extinct 10,000 years ago. A child's toy soldier, carved from wood, its paint faded to ghosts of color. He signed to her slowly, carefully. Mine, long ago, when I was small. She looked at him with new eyes, seeing not the ancient, terrifying king, but a boy who had once played with wooden toys. She reached out tentatively and touched the soldier, her fingers gentle on the worn surface. She looked at him, a question in her eyes. He nodded. She picked it up, cradling it in her palm, and her hands began to move. She told him a story, her signs fluid and expressive. A story of a brave soldier who fought dragons and saved kingdoms. It was a child's tale, simple and sweet, and it was the story he had told himself 1,000 years ago, when the world was young and he was mortal. He had forgotten it until she gave it back to him. He also showed her the hilt of his father's sword, the blade long since shattered and lost. He signed the word for father, then battle, then gone. She understood. She touched his arm, a brief, sympathetic gesture, and signed a word he knew well. Sad. He nodded. Sad. She grew bolder as the weeks passed. One evening she led him to the map in the library, the one that had started it all. She pointed to the city at the foot of the mountains, her city. Her fingers began to move, a rapid, emotional torrent of signs. She told him of her life there, of the smell of the sea on a stormy day, of the taste of hot bread from the bakery on a cold morning, of Anya, her friend, whose laughter was like a string of bells. She told him of her mother, who had taught her the hand talk, and who had died when she was just a child. Her hands slowed as she described her mother's face, her fingers tracing the memory of a cheek, the curve of a smile. A single tear escaped and traced a path down her cheek. Kazian stood perfectly still, watching this silent outpouring of a life he had so casually upended. He had thought of her as having no past, no connections, no story. He had chosen her for her perceived political neutrality. He was a fool. Her life had been small, perhaps, but it had been rich and full and hers, and he had stolen it. He felt an emotion so ancient he barely recognized it. It was a hollow, aching thing that settled deep in his chest. It was regret. He reached out, his hand hovering in the air between them, wanting to offer a comfort he did not know how to give. He wanted to tell her he was sorry, but this time the word felt too small for what he had done. Instead, he did something he had not done in centuries. He pulled her into an embrace. She stiffened, shocked, and then slowly, tentatively, she leaned into him, her head resting against his chest. He was cold, impossibly cold, but he was solid. He was there. And for the first time since she had arrived, Emma let herself weep, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs, while the king who had bought her held her and wished desperately that he knew how to make things right. The change in the king did not go unnoticed. The court, a finely tuned instrument of observation and intrigue, registered the shift with seismographic precision. The king was spending time with his mortal bride, not just enduring her presence at meals, but seeking her out. Whispers followed them down the silent corridors, slithering from behind tapestries and ornate columns. Lord Valerius watched with a grim, calculating expression, his thin lips pressed into a bloodless line. He had orchestrated this gambit to neutralize the feuding factions, to give his king a shield of political immunity. 6 months after the wedding, he delivered his report in the king's private study. The northern and southern factions have withdrawn their marriage demands, my liege. The Eastern Bloc has quieted. They see the futility of challenging a decision already made. Your gambit worked. Cassian looked up from the book he was reading, a primer on advanced signing techniques. It was never a gambit, Valerius. The old advisor's eyes narrowed slightly. No, sire, I suppose it wasn't. He paused. The kingdom is more stable than it has been in 3 centuries. The council is compliant. You have achieved everything we set out to do. And yet you are troubled. I am simply observing, my king. The mortal girl is a candle. You are the sun. One is destined to burn out, leaving the other in darkness. Cassian's hand tightened on the book. I am aware. Are you? Valerius asked quietly. Because from where I stand, you are falling in love with your own political instrument. And when she is gone, enough. The word was soft but carried the weight of absolute authority. Valerius bowed. As you wish, my king. But as he left, the seed of unease in his ancient heart took deeper root. Lady Seraphina, whose ambitions were as sharp and pointed as her teeth, saw Emma not as an insect, but as a rival. She saw the way Cassian's eyes would follow the girl's hands as they moved, his expression one of intense, unnerving focus. She had coveted the empty space beside the throne for 3 centuries, and she would not be supplanted by a silent, short-lived piece of human driftwood. The microaggressions began subtly. A gown of Emma's would be accidentally ruined by a spilled decanter of blood wine. A treasured book of illustrations in the library would be found with its pages torn. Servants would pretend not to see her, leaving her standing in a corridor for hours. These were petty, childish cruelties, designed to remind her of her place, to underscore her otherness. Emma bore them with the same quiet resilience with which she had borne everything else. She had survived poverty and neglect. She would survive the spite of bored, immortal creatures. She did not complain to Cassian. What would she say? Your people are unkind? It was a truth as old as the stones of the castle. But Cassian saw. He saw the flicker of pain in her eyes when she discovered the ruined dress. He saw the way she carefully, painstakingly tried to tape the torn pages of the book back together, her hands gentle on the damaged paper. He saw everything. And the cold, dormant fury that slept in the heart of his ancient being began to stir. The breaking point came during a formal reception. The great hall was filled with the vampire elite, a shimmering, dangerous sea of silks and jewels. Emma stood by Cassian's side, a small, silent island in their midst. She wore a gown of deep blue velvet, and her hair was adorned with small diamond pins that glittered like stars. She looked almost like one of them, but the frantic, living pulse in her throat betrayed her. Cassian was speaking with a visiting dignitary from the southern fiefdoms when Lady Seraphina approached Emma, a goblet of wine in her hand. "Our silent queen," Seraphina purred, her voice dripping with condescending sweetness. "You look so lovely tonight, a doll for our king to play with. But tell me, do you ever grow bored? The nights are so very long after all." She smiled, a flash of white, pointed teeth. Emma simply looked at her, her expression calm, her hands still at her sides. This refusal to be baited, this silent dignity, only enraged Seraphina more. "Oh, I forgot," she said with a laugh that was like the tinkle of breaking glass. "You cannot tell me. How convenient for you. No need to have any thoughts in that pretty little head at all." She made a gesture as if she had tripped, stumbling forward and, accidentally, spilling the dark red contents of her goblet down the front of Emma's blue gown. The red on blue was a shocking splash of violence. The wine, thick and potent, stained the velvet immediately, looking horribly like blood. A collective gasp went through the hall, followed by a sudden, predatory silence. All eyes were on the queen, the king, and the stain. Seraphina made a show of dabbing at the spot with a lace handkerchief. "Oh, my dearest apologies. How terribly clumsy of me." Emma looked down at the stain, her face pale. She did not look angry or even sad. She just looked tired. She had been fighting so hard to build a small space for herself in this world, and they would not even grant her that. She was, and always would be, a thing to be defaced. Cassian had not moved. He had watched the entire exchange, his face an emotionless mask. But the temperature in the hall had dropped 20 degrees. The candles flickered as if in a sudden wind. He turned his head slowly, his winter night eyes fixing on Seraphina. He did not speak. He did not have to. The pure, unadulterated menace that rolled off him was a physical force. Seraphina's triumphant smirk faltered. The color drained from her already pale face. She had miscalculated. She had thought the king would be amused by her little game, or at worst, indifferent. She had not expected this. This was the fury of a glacier, slow, silent, and unstoppable. Cassian took a step forward. He did not look at Emma. He did not look at the stain. He looked only at Seraphina, and in his eyes she saw a promise of an eternity of pain. "You," he said, and the single word was a death sentence, "have offended the crown." But before he could do more, a small, warm hand touched his arm. He froze, the touch a brand of heat on his cold skin. He looked down. It was Emma. She was looking up at him, her expression not fearful, but pleading. She shook her head, a small, sharp gesture. Then she raised her other hand, her fingers shaping a sign. It was one he knew well now. Her fingers intertwined, a gesture of unity, of together. Then she brought her hand to her chest, over her heart, and swept it out to encompass both of them. Us. Then she pointed to Seraphina and made a sign he knew all too well, a single finger drawing a circle. Alone. The meaning was clear and devastatingly complex. Do not do this. Do not separate us from them further. Do not make her alone, as I have been. It was an act of breathtaking empathy. In the moment of her own humiliation, She was thinking of her tormentor. She was asking him, her king, her husband, the most powerful being in the room, for mercy. Not for herself, but for another. In that moment, Cassian understood. This was not about the dress. This was not about Seraphina. This was about power. And his quiet, mortal queen had just shown him a kind of power he had never known. The power not to break, but to mend. He looked from Emma's earnest, pleading face to Seraphina's terrified one. The rage was still there, a coiled serpent in his gut, but it was tempered now by a new, startling emotion: awe. He took a deep breath, the first he'd felt he'd needed in centuries. He let it out slowly. He turned his gaze back to Seraphina, the full weight of his authority in his eyes. "You will apologize to your queen," he said, his voice dangerously soft. "And then you will leave my court. You are banished for one mortal lifetime, 80 years. You will return when she is dust, and you will remember this lesson every day of your exile. Your estates and titles are frozen. You will live as she once lived, in poverty, in silence, among mortals. Perhaps you will learn what you destroyed tonight." Seraphina's face crumpled. 80 years to an immortal was an eternity of punishment, and to live as a mortal, stripped of privilege, was a fate worse than death. "Your Majesty, please." "Apologize." His voice cracked like a whip. Seraphina turned to Emma, her face streaked with tears of humiliation and terror. I am sorry, Your Majesty. Please forgive me." Emma looked at her for a long moment, then nodded, once. A simple gesture of acceptance. Cassian then turned his back on Seraphina, a dismissal more absolute than any execution. He offered his arm to Emma. She took it, her small hand resting in the crook of his elbow. Together, without a backwards glance, they walked out of the great hall, leaving a stunned and silent court in their wake. That night, he had not defended his property. He had defended his queen. And in doing so, he had defended himself from the man he used to be. The incident at the reception was a turning point. Cassian had not only defended Emma, he had publicly aligned himself with her, elevating her from a political statement to his unequivocal partner. The court, ever sensitive to the winds of power, adjusted accordingly. The open contempt vanished, replaced by a fearful, grudging respect. Emma was no longer the king's folly. She was the king's heart, and to harm her was to invite a wrath no one dared to face. The palace, while still cold, no longer felt hostile. A space had been cleared for her, a small pocket of safety carved out by the king's silent fury and her own quiet grace. Their world shrank, becoming an intimate universe of two. They spent their days in the library, their nights in the observatory. The silence between them was no longer empty, but filled with a rich, complex language of shared glances, small touches, and the intricate dance of their hands. He taught her the history of his people, not as a king reciting facts, but as a man recounting his life. He told her of the great wars, of the sun-scorched world before the long gloom, of the loneliness of outliving everyone and everything he had ever known. His hands shaped the words for loss, grief, and forever. And for the first time, he was not just stating a concept, he was sharing a feeling. She, in turn, opened her world to him. She taught him the names of the wildflowers that grew in the meadows outside her village. She described the feeling of the sun on your skin, a sensation he had not experienced in millennia. She taught him the sign for hope, a hand rising from the heart toward the sky, like a bird taking flight. She was a window into a world of warmth, light, and ephemeral beauty he had long forgotten. He found himself looking at his own world through her eyes. The crystal flowers in the garden, which he had always seen as perfect, unchanging symbols of his reality, now seemed merely cold and lifeless compared to the fragile, mortal shoots she had nurtured in the conservatory. That small garden had grown. What had been a few struggling seedlings were now climbing vines, herb bushes, even a small rose that had somehow, miraculously, bloomed in the thin light. The scent of living earth and green things had begun to permeate the eastern wing, a heresy of life in a kingdom of the dead. It was, he realized, the most beautiful thing in the entire palace. One night they sat in the bell tower, the highest point of the citadel, looking down at the sleeping city. A blanket of mist filled the valley, and the lights of the mortal world were soft, blurred jewels. Emma shivered, and without thinking, Cassian drew his heavy cloak around her shoulders. She leaned against him, her head resting on his chest. He could feel the steady, rhythmic beat of her heart, a frantic, fragile drum against his own still, silent core. It was the sound of life, of time passing. It was the most terrifying and beautiful sound he had ever heard. She looked up at him, her face illuminated by the pale moonlight. Her hands came up, her movements slow, deliberate in the small space between them. "Why?" she asked. A single, simple sign. Why me? He had been waiting for this question. He had asked it of himself 1,000 times. The original answer, politics, convenience, strategy, was a bitter ash in his mouth. It was the truth, but it was no longer the whole truth. He looked down at her, at this impossible woman, who had quietly, inexorably dismantled the fortress he had built around his heart. He wanted to tell her everything. He wanted to tell her that he had been a hollow thing, a king of dust and shadows, and she had filled his world with color and meaning. He wanted to tell her that her silence was more eloquent than any words he had ever heard. He wanted to tell her that the sight of her smile was the only thing that made his eternal life bearable. He raised his own hands, his movements still hesitant, still clumsy compared to her fluid grace. He tried to shape the words, but the signs felt inadequate, too small for the enormity of what he felt. At first he signed, to anger them. He gestured vaguely toward the court below. A tool. The sign was harsh, clinical. He saw the flicker of pain in her eyes, the old wound, and he hated himself for it. But now, he paused, searching for the right signs, the right concepts. How do you explain a sunrise to someone who has only ever known twilight? He gave up on words. He lowered his hands and gently cupped her face. He leaned down, his cold lips meeting her warm ones. It was not a kiss of passion, but of reverence. It was a confession, an apology, a promise. It was the answer to her question. In that moment, surrounded by the cold, silent stones of his kingdom, with the fragile, beating heart of the world tucked against his chest, Cassian, the 1,000-year-old king, the master of shadows and death, finally understood. He was in love, utterly, irrevocably, and hopelessly in love. The realization did not come with a crash of thunder, but with a quiet, profound sense of peace. It was as if a piece of him he hadn't known was missing had finally slotted into place. He had spent an eternity alone, and he had never realized it until he had found her. The weeks that followed this silent confession were the happiest of Emma's life, and the most vibrant of Cassian's long existence. The love between them, now acknowledged, transformed the cold palace. There was laughter now, Emma's silent, shaking laughter that made her whole body light up, and Cassian's rare, rusty chuckle, a sound that startled the very dust in the rafters. He filled her world with wonders. He commissioned artisans to expand her conservatory, building a massive glass house with walls of enchanted crystal that could capture and amplify even the weakest rays of filtered sunlight. Soon, the scent of damp earth and living blossoms began to permeate the eastern wing, and servants would detour through the corridors just to breathe in the smell of life. He had the royal musicians learn the folk songs of her village, and they would play for her in the evenings. She would close her eyes, and her hands would fly, translating the music into stories of harvest festivals and spring dances, her movements a joyous blur. Cassian would watch, mesmerized. He was learning to read her not just as a language, but as poetry. He learned the subtle shifts in her posture, the way the speed of her signs changed with her mood, the stories told by the light in her eyes. He had spent a millennium mastering the art of power, but with her, he was learning the art of attention. For Emma, the love of the king was a bewildering, overwhelming gift. The man who had been her purchaser had become her devoted student, her confidant, her fiercest protector. She saw past the crown and the cold skin to the lonely soul beneath. She saw the boy who had loved a wooden soldier, the son who had revered his father, the king who carried the weight of ages on his shoulders. She did not fear him. She saw his darkness, his capacity for terrible violence, but she also saw how carefully he held her, as if she were the most precious, fragile thing in the universe. She was not his prisoner. She was his anchor. She was the one who was teaching him how to be human again. Their connection was a source of endless fascination and frustration for the court. They could not understand it. There were no words, no grand pronouncements, no political advantages to be gained. It was a quiet, private thing, built in the spaces between gestures. It was a love that defied their understanding of the world, which was built on power, bloodlines, and transactions. This was something else. This was grace. Valerius watched it all with a detached, academic interest. His king was transformed. The old cynicism was gone, replaced by a kind of fierce, protective tenderness. The kingdom was more stable than it had been in centuries. The king was happy. By all accounts, his gambit had been a spectacular, unintended success. And yet, the knot of unease in his ancient, desiccated heart continued to tighten. He knew the mortal girl was a candle, and his king was the sun. One was destined to burn out, leaving the other in a darkness more profound than any he had known before. One afternoon, Cassian found Emma in her conservatory. She was sitting on a small wooden bench, bathed in a shaft of pale, winter sunlight filtering through the enchanted glass. She had a book in her lap, not one of his ancient texts, but a children's book with simple drawings and words he had procured for her from the city. She was painstakingly tracing the letters with her finger, trying to match the written word to the signs she knew. A small frown of concentration creased her brow. He came up behind her silently and looked over her shoulder. The page showed a drawing of a family. A mother, a father, a small child with bright, laughing eyes. He watched as her finger traced the word for child. Then, her own hand came up, and she hesitantly formed the sign. A cradle, rocked by gentle hands. She held the sign for a long moment, then her hand fell back into her lap. She looked out at her vibrant, living garden, but her eyes were distant, filled with a deep and ancient sorrow. Cassian felt a chill that had nothing to do with the winter air. He had given her a palace, jewels, a garden of impossible beauty. He had given her his heart. But there were things he could not give her. A life lived fully in the sun, a child of her own, a future that was not bound to his eternal night. He saw for the first time the true cost of her love for him. She had not just given up her old life, she had given up all possible future lives. She was tethered to his immortality, a flower blooming in a sealed tomb. The joy he had felt, so pure and bright, was suddenly shadowed by a vast, terrifying grief. He loved her, and his love was a cage, more beautiful than her first one, but a cage nonetheless. The realization settled upon Cassian like a shroud. He loved her, and because he loved her, he had begun to mark time. For 1,000 years, seasons had been suggestions, decades had been heartbeats, centuries had been breaths. Time was a placid ocean on which he drifted, unchanging. But Emma was a clock. Her every breath, every heartbeat, every new line that appeared at the corner of her eyes, a faint, beautiful web from so much smiling, was a tick of an unstoppable countdown. He found himself studying her, cataloging the small, human signs of her magnificent, fleeting life. The way the morning light caught the first few strands of silver in her dark hair. The slight hesitation in her step that hadn't been there a year ago. The way she sometimes pressed a hand to her lower back after a long day in her garden. These were the markers of a life well lived, the beautiful, inevitable processes of mortality. And they terrified him. He had all of eternity, and she had what? A few more decades? A handful of years? He had wasted so much of it at the beginning. The first months of their marriage, he had treated her as a ghost, an object. Months. To him, it had been a blink. To her, it was a significant portion of the precious, limited time they had together. The regret was a physical poison, a constant, burning ache in his chest. He had been a fool, a proud, callous fool, and he had squandered a treasure he hadn't even recognized. He considered the obvious solution, the one any of his kind would have chosen, the embrace, the dark gift. He could make her like him. They could have eternity together. He imagined it, her skin growing pale and cold, her heart falling silent, the warm, vibrant life in her eyes being replaced by the predatory stillness of his own. He pictured her in the garden, her hands moving to pluck a rose, only to find the bloom withering at her supernaturally cold touch, the living things she loved recoiling from her. He saw her looking at the sun, not with longing, but with fear and pain. He remembered the turned servant Emma had met in her first weeks, a hollow woman who moved through the palace like a beautiful automaton, who had mentioned once, in passing, that she could no longer remember what strawberries tasted like, or what it felt like to cry. He would be preserving the vessel, but killing the soul. He would be destroying the very things he loved about her. Her warmth, her connection to the living world, her beautiful, fragile humanity. To make her immortal would be the ultimate act of selfish cruelty. It would be to save himself from the pain of losing her, at the cost of her very being. He could not do it. He would not. Emma sensed the shift in him. The joy that had illuminated their world was now tinged with a new, somber quality. He held her more tightly, his gaze lingering on her face as if trying to memorize every line and curve. The questions he asked her with his hands changed. He no longer asked about her past, but about her feelings. Are you happy? Do you want for anything? Are you afraid? She always answered with a smile and the same signs. I have you. I am happy. I am not afraid. But she saw the shadow in his eyes, a grief so profound it seemed to have no bottom. She knew he was mourning her while she was still alive. One evening, as a cold rain lashed against the windows of the library, she confronted it. She found an old medical text, a book of anatomical drawings. She opened it to a page showing a human heart with its intricate network of veins and arteries. She placed the book in front of him. Then she made the sign for human, pointing to herself, and tapped the drawing of the heart. Her hand fluttered over it, like a struggling bird. Weak, slow, dying. Then she turned the page to a drawing of a bat, the closest approximation the book had to his world. She pointed to him, then to the drawing. She made the sign for strong, forever. She looked at him, her eyes clear and steady. She wasn't asking a question. She was making a statement. She understood. She had always understood. Cassian looked at the diagrams, at the simple, brutal truth laid out before him. This, then, was the final lesson she had to teach him. Acceptance. He reached across the table and took her hand. It was warm, the skin soft, the pulse in her wrist a steady, living rhythm. He brought it to his lips and pressed a kiss to her knuckles. I know, he signed with his free hand, his movements heavy. I am sorry. She shook her head, a fierce, sharp motion. She pulled her hand free and signed with a speed and intensity he had never seen before. No. Do not be sorry. Do not waste the time we have with sorrow. I have lived more in these years with you than I ever did in all the years before. You taught me I was not invisible. You gave me a world. Do not mourn the sunset when the sky is still so beautiful. Her hands came to rest on his, her touch a comfort and a command. Live with me now, in this moment. That is all I ask. It was the bravest thing he had ever witnessed. She was staring into the abyss of her own mortality, and her only concern was for his peace. She was comforting him for the loss he was about to endure. The sheer, staggering force of his love for her threatened to undo him. He nodded, unable to form a sign, a lump of ancient, unshed tears lodged in his throat. He would do as she asked. He would not waste another moment. He would savor every second, every glance, every touch. He would fill her remaining time with so much life and so much love that it would burn bright enough to last him for the rest of eternity. The tragedy was not that she would die. The tragedy was that he would have to live without her, and he was only just beginning to understand how impossible that would be. They lived as she had asked, in the now. The shadow of the future was always there, a long, dark shape at the edge of their vision, but they chose not to look at it. They filled their days with small, perfect moments. They had picnics of bread and cheese and mortal wine in the glass house, surrounded by the scent of earth and blooming flowers. They took to walking the castle ramparts at dusk, watching the sky bleed from bruised purple into inky black, her small hand tucked securely in his. He read to her, his voice a low, soothing rumble, translating the ancient epics of his people into the language of their hands as he went. He discovered she had a wicked sense of humor. She would tease him, her hands creating witty, insightful caricatures of the dour members of his court. She invented a sign for Valerius that involved a long nose and a sour expression that made Cassian laugh until his sides ached. For the first time in centuries, the onyx spire felt less like a fortress and more like a home. The servants, who had once feared their king, now saw a man besotted. They grew fond of their silent queen, who always had a kind look for them, who took the time to learn the signs for their names. Lyra, the maid who had first been assigned to her, became a true friend, and Emma, with Cassian's blessing, began to teach her and other willing servants the hand talk. The silence of the palace was slowly being populated with a new kind of conversation. Years passed. 5, 10, 20, 30. To Cassian, it was a sigh. To Emma, it was a lifetime. The silver in her hair became a brilliant streak, then a crown of white. The lines around her eyes deepened, mapping the geography of her smiles and the weight of her years. She moved more slowly, her body beginning to betray the vibrant spirit within. Her hands, once so quick and fluid, began to stiffen with age, the signs coming more slowly but no less eloquently. Cassian's love did not diminish. It deepened, intensified, transmuting from the passion of new love to the fierce, protective tenderness of a long-shared life. He was her shadow, her guardian, her constant companion. He helped her in the garden when her back grew too stiff to bend. He carried her up the long, winding stairs to the observatory when her legs grew too tired to climb. He was her strength, as she was his soul. The court watched this long, slow, inevitable decline with a kind of horrified awe. They had expected the king to tire of his mortal pet. They had expected him to replace her, or perhaps, in a fit of sentimentality, to give her the dark gift. They did not understand this devotion. They could not comprehend a love that honored the boundaries of mortality, that chose to embrace the pain of loss rather than desecrate the object of its affection. It was a foreign concept, this love that chose to break its own heart. Emma lived to a remarkable age for someone who had spent her youth in poverty and hardship. The physicians marveled at it, attributing it to the care and luxury of her later years. The good food, the warm rooms, the absence of grinding labor. But Kazian knew the truth. She lived because she wanted to. She lived for him, holding on with the same quiet stubbornness that had allowed her to survive the tavern, the cruelty of the court, the loneliness of those first terrible months. She lived because every day with him was a day worth living. But even love, even stubbornness, could not hold back time forever. In her 73rd year, as winter settled over the valley, Emma began to fade. It was not sudden, not dramatic. It was simply that the flame that had burned so brightly for so long was finally, gently, guttering. She slept more. She ate less. Her hands, which had spoken entire worlds, now rested quietly in her lap, too tired to move. Kazian sat by her bedside day and night, holding her hand, his stillness a stark contrast to the soft, shallow rhythm of her breathing. He would cool her brow with a cloth dipped in water from the mountain springs. He would gently spoon broth to her lips, though she could barely swallow. He talked to her, for the first time in years, using his voice as much as his hands, because her eyes were often closed now, and he needed her to know he was there. He told her stories of their life together. He reminded her of the first day in the library, of the stars in the observatory, of the taste of the wine at their picnics. He spoke of her garden, telling her how the roses she had planted decades ago had spread, their descendants now climbing the walls of the conservatory in a riot of mortal color. His voice was a low, constant murmur in the quiet room, a thread of sound for her to hold onto as she drifted. One night, deep in the heart of winter, her eyes fluttered open. She seemed lucid for the first time in days. There was a clarity to her gaze, a peace he had not seen before. She looked at him, and a faint smile touched her lips. She lifted a trembling hand, her fingers weak, the movements that had once been so fluid, now slow and uncertain. He leaned in close to read the ghost of a sign. "So beautiful," she signed, her gaze on his face. Tears, hot and searing, welled in his ancient eyes. He had not wept in over 1,000 years. He caught her hand, pressing it to his cheek. It was so cold, colder than his own. "Emma," he whispered, the name a prayer, a wound. She took a breath, a shallow, hitching thing. Her fingers moved again, one last time, against his skin. A single, perfect sign. The sign she had taught him for love, all those years ago. A hand placed over the heart, then extended outward. "I love you." "I love you," he said aloud, his voice breaking. "I love you, I love you, I love you." She smiled and her hand fell still. Then, with a soft sigh, like a candle being gently extinguished, she was gone. The silence she left behind was not the absence of sound. It was a living entity, a crushing, absolute void that consumed everything. The palace, which had so recently felt like a home, reverted to a tomb. The colors she had brought into his world bled back to gray. Cassian sat with her for 3 days, holding her cold hand, refusing to let her go. He watched as the last vestiges of warmth left her, as the beautiful, expressive life faded from her face, leaving behind a placid, marble mask. He was a king of the dead, and she had been his only living thing. Valerius finally dared to enter the room. He stood in the doorway, his face etched with a sorrow that was, for once, entirely genuine. "My king," he said softly, "the court, the kingdom, they await your word. They wish to prepare the funeral rites." Cassian did not look at him. He looked at the face of his wife, his love, his entire world. He finally, gently, laid her hand down on the bed. He stood up, his joints cracking like stone. He felt every one of his 1,000 years pressing down on him. "Prepare the pyre," he said, his voice a hollow rasp. "In the eastern courtyard, where her garden grows." "My king." "Do it." Valerius bowed and left. Cassian walked to the window and looked out. A bleak, gray dawn was breaking. The sun she had so loved was rising, a thing he had not seen directly in over a millennium. He turned back to Emma one last time, memorizing her face, the peace that had settled over her features. "You asked me to live in the moment," he said softly to her still form. "I did, and now those moments are all I have left." He leaned down and pressed a final kiss to her forehead. "But I find that I am a coward, my love. I cannot face the eternity without you. I will not." He straightened, his decision made. There was a finality to it, a peace. For the first time since she had died, he felt something other than crushing grief. He felt certainty. The funeral was held at sunset, as per his instructions. Emma's body was laid upon a bed of her own roses, dressed in a simple white gown. The court assembled in silence, even the most callous among them moved by the sight of their ancient, terrible king standing vigil over his mortal bride. Cassian stood at the head of the pyre, his face a mask of stone. Valerius approached, a torch in his hand. "My king, if you wish, I can—" Cassian took the torch from him. "No, this is mine to do." He looked down at Emma one last time, at the woman who had taught him what it meant to truly live, to truly love. Then he touched the torch to the kindling. The flames caught, spreading quickly, consuming the roses, the white gown, and finally, gently, her. He watched until she was nothing but ash and memory, until the flames had burned down to embers. The court waited for him to speak, to issue commands, to return to the business of being king. Instead, he removed his crown and handed it to Valerius. The old advisor's eyes widened. "My king, you will rule in my stead," Cassian said. "You have always been the better politician. The kingdom will be safe in your hands." "Sire, what are you—" Cassian did not answer. He turned and walked toward the eastern gate, the one that led out onto the ramparts that faced the rising sun. Valerius understood then, his ancient heart clenching. "No, my king, please!" Cassian kept walking. He climbed the stairs to the highest point of the eastern wall, the place where he and Emma had sat so many nights, watching the city lights and dreaming. The court followed at a distance, a processional of the damned watching their king walk toward his own end. The sun was rising, a glorious, terrible thing that painted the sky in shades of gold and rose and violent pink. It was the sun Emma had described to him, the sun she had loved, the sun he had not seen in 1,000 years. He stood on the wall and removed his cloak, letting it fall to the stone. "She taught me to live," he said, and his voice carried across the silent courtyard. "She taught me that love was not a weakness, but the only strength that mattered. She taught me that some things are worth dying for." He looked up at the rising sun. "I spent 1,000 years learning her language," he said softly, "only to be left with a universe of things I could no longer say to the only person who would have understood." He closed his eyes. "I am coming, my love. Wait for me." He stepped forward, into the full light of the rising sun. For a moment, he simply stood there, his face tilted upward, and on his cold features was an expression of pure, transcendent peace. The sunlight touched his skin, and he began to burn. Not with the violence of fire, but with a strange, beautiful luminescence. His skin glowed, brighter and brighter, as if he were becoming light itself. The vampires watching had to shield their eyes. Kazian felt no pain. He felt only warmth, blessed warmth, after a millennium of cold. He felt Emma's hand in his, though he knew it was impossible. He felt her presence, bright and welcoming, like walking into a room filled with sunlight after a long, dark night. He smiled. "There you are," he whispered. And then, like morning mist burned away by the rising sun, Kazian, the 1,000-year-old king of shadows and night, simply ceased to be. The court stood in stunned silence, staring at the place where their king had stood. There was nothing left. No ash, no bone. He had not burned. He had simply become light, and then vanished, leaving nothing behind but the memory of his love and his choice. In the eastern courtyard, in the garden Emma had built, a strange thing happened. The roses, which had been consumed by the funeral pyre, began to grow again. Overnight, new shoots emerged from the ash-covered earth, climbing faster and more vigorously than any mortal plant should. By dawn, the entire courtyard was covered in a riot of roses, white and pink and deep blood red, their scent so strong and sweet it filled the entire palace. They bloomed continuously, even in the dead of winter, even in the sunless gloom of the valley. The court whispered that it was a miracle. They said it was the king and queen, together at last, their love made manifest in the living world. They said that sometimes, on quiet nights, servants would see two figures walking in the rose garden, one tall and dark, one small and bright, their hands moving in a silent conversation, their laughter carried on the wind. Valerius, who became regent and ruled justly for centuries after, would sometimes stand at the window of Cassian's old study and look down at the roses. "You found your peace, my king," he would murmur. "You found each other, and perhaps that is the only true immortality any of us can hope for." The roses bloomed eternal, a garden of love in a kingdom of night, a testament to a king who had learned to live and a queen who had taught him how. They were together. They were forever. And in whatever realm lay beyond the veil of death, in whatever paradise souls like theirs might find, Emma and Cassian walked hand in hand, speaking their silent language, finally free from the tyranny of time.